Ago, the Berlin Wall was torn down by the people that it had divided for 3 decades. Berliners were euphoric. They were euphoric because the Berlin Wall was not merely a wall between East and West Berlin. It was the wall between East and West, period. It was the division of humanity into 2 different camps. And since labels and names are always changing and morphing, not to mention carrying decades of emotional baggage, let's reduce it to the most simple, emotionally neutral terms. Now, on one side of the wall, the eastern side, were the collectivists, who believed that society takes precedent over the person. This collectivism was advertised as new and scientific, but the fact is that collectivism has been the default condition of humanity since humanity began. Now, the actual newcomer to this clash of visions were the individualists on the western side. The first government in history dedicated to the idea of the individual being more worthy of protection than the state had just turned 170 years old when the 40-year conflict known as the Cold War began. Now, with the world in ruins after the defeat of Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy, these 2 ideologies had come under head-to-head conflict here in Berlin.
It quickly became evident that Soviet leaders were not interested in a free, unified Germany and were determined to induce or force the Western powers to leave Berlin. Certainly, the American and Western people do not want war, but all history has taught us the grim lesson that no nation has ever been successful in avoiding the terrors of war by refusing to defend its rights, by attempting to placate aggression.
From the East, the collectivist idea called communism had slugged its way for mile after bloody mile, limping and then striding and finally running across Eastern Europe from the Nazi high water mark at Stalingrad. The individualist ideology arrived by sea, storming ashore on the beaches of Normandy, and after being staggered once or twice, was racing across Western Europe in a gasoline-fueled Red Ball Express. Now, part of this idea was known as capitalism, but that was merely the economic system. Politically, morally, economically, and practically, these were called the forces of freedom for the simple reason that that's what they were. And as the collectivist nightmare known as the German National Socialist State, the Nazi state, wavered and collapsed and then imploded, these 2 antithetical ideologies met in Berlin. For it was in Berlin, where one world war had just ended, that the next world war was about to begin. Now, no one felt this divide more than the defeated Germans themselves. To them, this war of ideologies had an immediacy not felt anywhere else. The nation and former capital, Berlin, were split in half. One camp was occupied by the armies of the Soviet Union and the others by the armies of the United States, Great Britain, and in a rather generous gesture, France. There's nothing theoretical about the Berlin Wall. It was cold, thick, high, and deadly. It was a daily reminder to those on both sides of the sheer monumental luck, the city block that you lived on determining the fate of you, your children, and their children. No wonder they went at it with hammers and crowbars and even bare and bloody hands. But all of us who watched it happen felt that giddy, euphoric, mind-boggling sensation that had nothing to do with living in Berlin or even in Germany. We all cried when the wall came down, because with it collapsed from our shoulders the death sentence that we'd all been living under, because you cannot possibly understand how the world could have been locked in a life and death struggle for half a century unless you can put yourself in the position of those of us who lived through it or through any part of it. You see, when the Berlin Wall fell, it began to dawn on me, like it began to dawn on all of us, that there was going to be an actual future. And despite all the odds, we were going to live to see it. And this is what we saw.
Communism, according to all its own leaders, must be a system of international control and conformity.
Today, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is, Ich bin ein Berliner.
The only answer to communism is a massive offensive for freedom.
You and I have a rendezvous with destiny.
Never give in. Never give in. Never, never, never.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere. And all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow.
An iron curtain, he called it, on March 5th, 1946 at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri. Now, there was no mistaking the man speaking, of course, that bulldog language coming from the rounded, unimpressive, and slightly lisping voice, the leader of the only country to fight in World War II from the first day until the very last, had come to America in a strange and awful kind of disgrace. For while Britain had fought from the beginning to the end, he himself had been unceremoniously thrown out of office by the British nation he had just saved prior to the end of the war and the surrender of Japan.
The safety of the world, ladies and gentlemen, required a new unity in Europe from which no nation should be permanently outcast.
This man who'd warned the world of the rising threat from Adolf Hitler, the man mocked as a warmonger, a megalomaniac, and dangerously mentally unstable, the man who became Prime Minister of Great Britain on the day that his one ally, France, fell to the Nazis, this greatest of all Englishmen who alone rallied the British Empire from the brink of defeat and utter ruin and went on to lead it into its finest hour. Winston Churchill, as usual, had deployed his most powerful weapon, his rhetorical genius with the English language, and described in one sentence the shape of the 50-year war that had not yet even really begun. Which is, of course, the real question, isn't it? The Cold War effectively ended when the Berlin Wall came down, but when did it begin? Well, the collectivist Soviet superstate from the East, with its masses of infantry and tanks, never actually fired or received a single shot directly at or from the newest player on the world stage, a young American superpower whose Navy ruled the oceans and whose Air Force owned the skies of the entire world. This bizarre, once in all of history conflict, this life and death battle waged for half a century without a shot being fired between the two adversaries, this Cold War, well, it had to begin sometime. But when? If the two opponents in this nuclear standoff had never really been friends at the start of the Cold War, they'd not only never faced each other as enemies, but they were in fact allies. The Big Three, Stalin's Soviet Union, Churchill's Great Britain, and Franklin Roosevelt's United States of America, had together formed the alliance that had taken down both Germany and Japan. They had fought side by side for 3 terrible years. Now, Britain and Russia had been at war with each other only in the Crimea 90 years earlier, but all 3 countries had slogged through the mud together in World War I, so how could this happen? How could 3 countries, allies, through the 2 most horrific wars in human history, find themselves facing each other for a 3rd war with incalculably greater stakes? What had changed? Well, Russia had changed. So, did the Cold War actually start on March 15, 1917, when Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the Romanov throne that had ruled Russia for 300 years, launching the Russian Revolution? Did it begin 8 months later, when the First Revolution, a sloppy, badly run but liberal series of humane government reforms under Alexander Kerensky, was replaced when Vladimir Lenin and his ruthless Bolsheviks tore power away from the Kerensky government in the 10 days that shook the world and launched the Second Revolution, the October Revolution, that brought communism to Russia's brutalized people? Or did the Cold War begin even earlier, in the heart of the First War, when Imperial Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II risked a throw of the dice and delivered the virus of Lenin and his Bolsheviks on a sealed train through Germany and into Russia in order to bring down the Tsar and remove Russia from World War I? Now, and that, by the way, was a decision that the Germans would sorely regret when Lenin's communist descendants threw Germany back into Berlin 2 decades later during World War II. And if World War III, the Cold War, had been born in the ashes of World War II, but World War II had been the inevitable result of the Treaty of Versailles that had ended World War I, is it possible that distant history will view all of these nuances as nonsense, concluding that Wars I, II, and III were really just one catastrophic conflict with timeouts for rearmament and recruitment? In other words, did the war that ended with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 actually begin on June 28, 1914, with the bullets fired from the pistol of Serbian anarchist Gavrilo Princip into Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austrian Empire, lighting the spark that exploded the powder keg of Europe and launched World War I? I suppose you could make a case for these or even other dates. It's not easy to find the beginning of a war that never fired a single shot. But if I had to pick a date, I think the best candidate would be June 19, 1948, when the Soviet military blocked Western access to Berlin, which lay within the Soviet zone of occupation. I think the Cold War began where it ended 41 years later. The Cold War began and ended in Berlin. Now, in this 13-part series, we'll look at this half-century of nuclear nightmares from start to finish. From its beginning with the Berlin airlift, 12 years before the wall was even built, and on through the following 5 decades. Korea, Soviet invasions in Hungary and Czechoslovakia, the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the promise of détente, which looked to be a way out from living in the shadow of the mushroom cloud, but in the end was, at best, the 7th-inning stretch. Then on to Reagan and Thatcher, Soviets in Afghanistan, a Polish Pope, an electrician in Gdansk, Glasnost and Perestroika, Star Wars in Reykjavik, the fall of the wall, and the biggest Christmas present of all time. If we're going to travel past these epic milestones and ride the historical rail which started in 1948 and ended in 1991, we have a choice. And the choice is simple. Do we want to look forward or do we want to look back? So in the interest of honesty and as a confession of bias, I'm going to exert the highest effort I can to be as fair as possible when I talk about what we saw during the Cold War, but ultimately, it will be the story of how this history looked from the West. If you look at it all with an open mind, hopefully at the end of this series, you will have gained some new perspectives on things that seemed completely opaque at the time. But I think that even if I were to achieve the historically impossible, a perfectly balanced and unbiased retelling of this story, there would be little doubt that not only did one of these two antithetical systems prevail in the end, it was the one that deserved to prevail in the end. And as an American, I assumed that I would tell the story more or less from the American point of view. But what I found as I wrote it was that I was spending more and more time with the Russians. Spending time with the Russians because no one had heard that side of the story, and also what was going on in Russia is almost beyond imagination. We're going to tell this story going forward, but in order to do that, we're going to have to go back to the starting line because it's hard to know where you're going if you don't know where you've been. So, let's set the dials on the Wayback Machine for June 19th, 1948, and then push the button, Frank. Lenin, Trotsky, Molotov, Stalin, all of them pseudonyms, names invented by the men who bestowed them upon themselves. These were the founding fathers of the Russian Revolution. And since the thesis of this entire What We Saw adventure is that whatever was on one side of the Berlin Wall was a negative image of what was on the other side, it bears mentioning that while the American Revolution began with a collection of prominent citizens boldly, and in the case of John Hancock, even brazenly, signing their real names to a Declaration of Independence, the Russian Revolution was born of men constantly on the run from police, wearing disguises as they were smuggled in and out of secret safe houses, men whose real names were known to the Tsar's secret police. Unlike the proud, prominent, and successful Americans of 1776, the Russians of 1917 were unknown students, radicals, outlaws, men robbing banks and naming themselves after romantic figures in revolutionary literature, or more likely, intellectuals sitting in cafes in France and Switzerland, endlessly dicing and parsing and debating political theory. Theory. Always theory. Marxists, Leninists, Trotskyites, Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, Zenobites, debating Bukharism, sharing safe houses, sharing wives, engaged in passionate screaming matches that sometimes ended with fistfights in basements, cellars, all of it a very, very long way from the reasoned and disciplined appeal to logic and practicality among the most famous men in the country, openly finding entirely different answers in a public hall in Philadelphia. So, who were these men of the Russian Revolution on the eastern side of the wall? Well, one of them, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, a man who called himself Lenin, a failed lawyer who watched an idealized older brother hanged by the Tsar's secret police after refusing to ask for clemency, or Lev Davidovich Bronstein, a brilliant, arrogant student who, against all odds, would become a kind of military genius who virtually corralled the revolution with Lenin under the alias Leon Trotsky. Another one was Vyacheslav Mikhailovich Skarabin, a dour, humorless apparatchik capable of prodigious amounts of work and who named himself Molotov, the Hammer. And, of course, Joseph Vissarionovich Zhugasvili, a former choir boy from the Caucasus with a badly crushed arm and the ravages of smallpox written forever across his face, an utterly ruthless, utterly paranoid, low-level strongman calling himself Koba, constantly pursued by the Okhrana, the Tsar's secret police, who arrested him 7 times, exiled him 6 times, and who had escaped, essentially just walking out of Siberia, 5 times before meeting his idol Lenin, his nemesis Trotsky, and his lieutenant Molotov, and finally changing his name yet again to Stalin, which means the man of steel. Now, these are the names that most people know, but to really understand the Soviet Union, to really get it into your bones what it was like in Soviet Russia, you have to go to other names. Dzerzhinsky, Yagoda, Yezhov, Beria, the Cheka, the GPU, the NKVD, the MGB, the KGB, endless rebranding of the same dreaded Soviet secret police through which the Russian people would be ruled, intimidated, and pacified through the years using the only real weapon that these revolutionary intellectuals really knew how to wield, and that weapon was terror. If we were to start the Cold War in 1948, it would be incomprehensible to understand everything that followed without understanding these men, these names, and some locations as well. For example, in the heart of modern Moscow stands Lubyanka Square, one of the highlights of which is the children's store. It's a toy store. It's got soaring arched windows and it's lit with smiling cartoon bunnies and teddy bears and elves. Inside of it is a children's heaven. If Santa had owned a factory instead of a workshop, this is what it would look like on Christmas Eve as the reindeer were being harnessed to the sled. But just across the street from the children's heaven is an adult hell, and this one was not make-believe. This building, the Lubyanka, was and remains a very cruelly real structure. No one knows exactly how many people were shot in the back of the head from the basement of the building across from the toy store, but it certainly was not less than 10,000 human beings and likely very many more. This building was the Lubyanka proper, the building the square had been named for. Bright yellow and cheery in the summer sunshine if you look it up on Google Maps today. Designed back in 1897 and expanded in 1946, this neo-Baroque structure looks like a Tsarist office building. That's exactly what it was. The gray granite base of the Lubyanka is 2 stories tall. The main structure shows an additional 5 rows of windows, but during the Cold War, Soviet citizens said that the Lubyanka was the tallest building in the world because you could see Siberia from its basement. Now, today, out in front of the Lubyanka, there's a low mound covered with flowers on the Google Maps view, but for the duration of the Cold War, that mound of flowers was the base of a large statue of Iron Felix. That'd be Felix Dzerzhinsky, founder of the Cheka, which is an acronym for the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission. Just as the Soviet state was collapsing in 1991, a construction team in the middle of the night ripped Iron Felix down from his pedestal in front of that office building, which to this day is the home of the FSB, the Federal Security Service of the Russian Federation. Did you know that in Russia today, there's a petition to restore the statue of Iron Felix Dzerzhinsky and put it back in its rightful place outside of this Lubyanka building, and that petition is gaining momentum. Now, as for my personal opinion, I agree. I say put the statue back. If you're not willing to tear down this mass murder factory, then at the very least, you should restore it to its original condition. Dzerzhinsky was Lenin's right arm. The Cheka was Lenin's lever, his bludgeon, really. And the Lubyanka, just across the street from the toy store, was a place of abiding terror for the entire duration of the Soviet Union. In that basement, for decades, innocent Russian civilians who'd been arrested over no more than a glance or a whisper were packed shoulder to shoulder in large cells, holding perhaps 50 people each from the looks of it. Every night, the door to those cells were opened and a list of names were called. Every night, the person named would step out into the hallway and then be led down an unpainted, unplastered corridor where Russian martial arts tunes were being played on a photograph at ear-splitting levels, not so much to cover the gunshots as to suppress the sound of the screaming. Stripped naked groups of 6 people at a time were walked through pools of freezing water and stood on wooden duckboards facing wooden doors covered with bullet holes. Some would be arguing, some would be cursing the Chekists in their leather trench coats, some would be trying to bargain with them. Very few of them struggled or even tried to run away, none of it mattered, and they all knew it. They stood up in front of 6 men with revolvers facing away from them towards the door directly in front of each one of them. Families or couples that were brought in together would often hold hands, sometimes complete strangers would as well. Then off to the side, a 7th Chekist would raise a stick, and as he brought it down, 6 revolvers would fire, aiming for the back of the neck. The 6 pale white bodies would then collapse into the freezing water. A cart on rails would be brought forward, and the 6 bodies heaped on top of it. The cart would then trundle back to a different part of the basement, where hemp ropes would be tied around the feet of the corpses, and they would be hoisted up one at a time by 2 sweating men heaving on the pulley up to a truck parked in the closed-off square behind the front of the building. The bodies would then be stacked like cordwood, and when the truck was full, a tarp would be thrown over the pile. Now, hands and legs sometimes poked out from underneath these truckload tarps, which were headed off to open pits on the outskirts of Moscow. But this wasn't a bug, it was a feature. The Chekists wanted people to whisper about what they'd seen. Meanwhile, of course, back in the basement, a man quickly hosed the blood from the wooden doors and rinsed most of the red from the water on the floor, and 6 more naked, weeping people stepped dutifully forward and took their places facing the doors. Perhaps many of them wondered if these were the doors to their future. It'd be appropriate if they'd done so. You see, there was nothing behind these doors except for the stone-cold walls of the Lubyanka. The doors were there to prevent ricochets from clipping the executioners. And so it went, night after night, year after year, as the enemies of the people met their revolutionary justice. Now, apologists for this system blame it on Stalin, but this was all Lenin's work. His state could not function without the Lubyanka and Iron Felix. After Lenin died in 1924, Stalin led the Soviet Union through a massive modernization program, taking everything from the peasant farmers, including their seed corn. When the peasants resisted Lenin, then Stalin sent the Chekists out to the countryside, where they immediately shot anyone found hoarding so much as a handful of grain. Stripped of absolutely everything in order to feed the workers of the new Soviet factories, millions of peasants slowly starved to death, but not before killing all of their cattle and horses in order to deny them to the secret police. And there were worse places than the Lubyanka. Just a few miles to the northwest, hidden among an imposing wall, was what looks to the modern eye like a slum complex. But this was Lefortovo prison. This is where the more important political prisoners were sent for extended torture sessions. He simply did not say the word Lefortovo out loud. In fact, you didn't say anything out loud that would only guarantee your passage from outside to inside. The Lefortovo prison or the Lubyanka, long before Lenin and Iron Felix were born during the reign of Catherine the Great, there lived an aging czarist aristocrat named Darya Salkova. Widowed at age 25, an inheritor of a vast estate just 10 miles to the south of Lubyanka Square. After many lonely years, she found herself a young lover, but when he ran off with a younger woman, Salkova didn't take it at all well. Certain of her immunity, since she was nobility, she found she could freely indulge in some of her hobbies, which consisted of beating her serfs to death. Young women mostly, some as young as 10 years old, for minor offenses like insufficiently polished floors, or she might be temporarily sated by merely setting their hair on fire or dousing them with boiling water. Over the years, at least 138 of her servants were killed this way. All but 3 of them were women. Her plan for torturing her male servants consisted of simply killing the women in their lives. One of her serfs had 3 successive wives killed by the Blood Countess. But she was untouchable. Everybody knew that. The Cheka was untouchable too, and so were the GPU and the NKVD and the KGB. For 20 years prior to World War II, the residents of Moscow would stay awake at night staring at the ceiling. The organs of the government, the secret police, would generally raid a building in the dark of night, somewhere around 2 or 3 in the morning. These arrests became so commonplace that every single evening, people would stare at the ceiling and wait for the sound of those squat black police trucks, the Black Marias, to pull up outside and turn off their engines. Then more torture, as the creaky elevator slowly rose higher and higher. If it passed your floor, you could exhale at last and maybe grab a few hours of sleep. But in the morning, one of the apartments in that building would be crudely boarded up. Now, if you lived on that floor, you could tell who'd been taken to the Lubyanka or to Lefortovo by quickly discovering who was missing in the line outside of the floor's single toilet. There were even worse places out beyond even Siberia, visible from the basement of the world's tallest building. Russia was cluttered with dots marking each of these places, which looked like ants scurrying across the map of the world's largest country. 423 of these dots would eventually be built, and here's what they would be called. In Wikipedia, the Russian is Gulag. It means Main Administration Camps. It's an acronym. That acronym for the series of what were called main administration camps, the Gulag, was strung out like an island chain in what one of their residents, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, would refer to as the Gulag Archipelago. One of these dots, just one, was located in Kolyma. Nobody knows how many people actually died in the gold mines of Kolyma. All agree that in wintertime, the temperature in and around the camp was the only place where, by coincidence, both Fahrenheit and Celsius scales happened to converge, and that is at 40 degrees below zero for each of them. Initial estimates of 3 million people killed at Kolyma alone were no doubt too high. The lowest, well-researched figure is about 500,000. And the actual total, most likely, was around 800,000 human souls. Now that means that Kolyma is almost certainly tied for second place with Treblinka at 800,000 dead on the leaderboard from hell. It's unlikely, but it's entirely possible that the total death in this worst single island of the 423 islands in the Gulag archipelago exceeded the 1.1 to 1.6 million people killed at Auschwitz. No one's ever heard of Kolyma because, unlike with Auschwitz and Treblinka and Belzec and Sobibor, there are no pictures that survived from these death camps that could be seen from the basement in the building that still stands across from the toy store. Now, I'm telling you all of this because you will never understand the east side of the wall unless you understand a people who are more afraid of what's on their side of the wall than they are of what's on the other. Now, things were different on the west side of the wall when the Cold War began in 1948. To understand just how different, consider some of these numbers. Russia, by far, suffered the most casualties in World War II. Some 25 million people were killed. That's almost 14% of the population at the beginning of the war, and Russia was a victor in that war. Only Poland suffered more per capita misery. 17% of all Poles alive in 1939 had been killed by 1945. Now, Germany, with 7 million killed, had lost 8% of the population. Japan, with 2.8 million, had lost about 4%. Now, contrast those numbers with those of Great Britain and the United States, both of which had bled and died to win the war, and both of whom had suffered terrible losses in that most terrible of wars. But 450,000 British died in World War II, as well as 420,000 Americans. Now that means that Great Britain lost a little less than 1% of their total pre-war population, and the United States lost 1/3 of 1%. Of the two superpowers that would go on to fight the Cold War, one of them, the Soviet Union, had lost 44 times as many people as a percentage of the total population than did the United States.
But let us remember those who will not come back, their constancy and courage in battle, their sacrifice and endurance in the face of a merciless enemy. Let us remember the men in all the services and the women in all the services who have laid down their lives. We have come to the end of our tribulation, and they are not with us at the moment of our rejoicing. And then let us salute in proud gratitude the great host of the living who have brought us to victory.
Now, aside from the countless personal tragedies that so many American families had to bear, the fact remains that in 1948, the United States stood so far above the rest of the world, both economically and spiritually, that it doesn't really seem fair to even place it on the same planet. Just a few months before the Soviet Union denied access to West Berlin, the Marshall Plan had gone into effect. Now, through the Marshall Plan, the United States spent $12 billion to rebuild the ruined nations of Europe. That's about $100 billion in today's money. Russia, however, declined the offer. Although they desperately needed it, Churchill's Iron Curtain had already come down. Britain, which had thrown out Churchill's Conservative Party along with Churchill himself, had put in its place a socialist government. So, while post-war Germany used the Marshall Plan money to build new factories, the UK spent most of it on things like heavily subsidized housing and free prescription eyeglasses. It would be well into the 1950s before Britain could be said to have recovered from this post-war catastrophe, while the full prosperity of post-war America would have to wait until the 1950s to really fully hit its stride. In 1948, the United States was the unchallenged master of the sea with 1,200 warships, including 27 aircraft carriers. The brand new United States Air Force had just broken the sound barrier a few months earlier when a drawling West Virginia pilot named Chuck Yeager, who shot down 5 German aircraft in a single day, took the Bell X-1 supersonic in the skies over the Mojave Desert.
Cracking the sound barrier in the X-1 marked another milestone in aviation history. The time, October 14th, 1947. The place, Air Force Flight Test Center at Muroc, California. The pilot, Captain Chuck Yeager.
Fighter jets had arrived. The F-80 Shooting Star was 4 years old. It wasn't a good fighter, but there was no way to know that yet. But these were just toys, because the United States Air Force had the long-range, state-of-the-art B-29 Superfortress, and it had a lot of them. There was no other airplane in the world like it. And while Stalin's Red Army had thousands and thousands of tanks and artillery pieces and millions of troops lined up on the east side of the Iron Curtain, the United States had essentially just one thing on the western side to stop all of that. The United States had the atomic bomb. And more than that, the United States had shown that it was willing to use it.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid manyfold, and the end is not yet.
So, there they stood, facing each other for a full half-century, neither side able to understand the other because of the historical lenses through which they viewed the world were trained in opposite directions. Soviet Russia had always been invaded. Always. It had lost 27 million people in the biggest invasion since Napoleon 129 years earlier, when Moscow had been burned to the ground. Now, aside from a few ineffective shells lobbed from a Japanese submarine against the Santa Barbara oil refinery and some minor unpleasantness in Washington, D.C. during the short-lived and largely forgotten War of 1812, America had remained untouched. The idea of a foreign army marching through the United States being as inconceivable as the Russian idea of a foreign army not marching through its borders. Russia had, and still has, an overwhelming psychological need for buffers. Entire nations which would have to be overrun before the invaders could again touch the sacred soil of the Rodina or the Russian homeland. The United States didn't have the slightest need for either buffers or conquest. The 2 largest bodies of water on the planet protected America, and we had the very best land on the planet as well, and it was right here at home, and there was plenty of it. Russia was inward-looking, suspicious, and ruthless. America was outward-looking, trusting, and naive. Each one thought that the other had the same motives as themselves, and it would take 50 years for both sides to discover that each side's motives mirrored the other. They were the inverse, the negative image of one another's strategies, plans, and ambitions. So, both sides stared across this great gulf, and all they could see of each other was the reflection of themselves. Well, I hope you enjoyed watching. You can watch episode 1 of this 13-part series on Daily Wire Plus for free. I hope you become a Daily Wire Plus member to see the rest. Click the link in the description to watch now, and thanks for watching.